You are listening to the podcast series of the Forum on Central and Eastern Europe of KU Leuven. In our 20-minute conversations, we discuss the latest academic research on the region. I am Kris Van Heuckelom, and in today's episode, I have the privilege and the opportunity to talk to Mirja Lecke, who has come to us from the University of Regensburg in Germany, where she is a chair of Slavic Literatures and Cultures. Her academic interests include culture in the Russian Imperial and the post-Soviet period and Polish literature of the Enlightenment and the post-communist era. She is the author of Westland, Polen und die Ukraine in der russischen Literatur von Pushkin bis Babel, a monograph about the representation of the Western borderlands in Russian imperial literature. The book came out in 2015. More recently, she co-edited, together with Efraim Sicher, Cosmopolitan Spaces in Odessa, a case study of an urban context, a book that came out from Academic Studies Press in 2023. Welcome to Leuven, Mirja, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation for a conversation on your past and ongoing research.
Thank you so much, Kris. It's my pleasure to be here.
Let's perhaps start from your book on Westland, or Westland in German. Where does the title come from and what does it actually stand for?
Westland is the translation of the Russian Zapadny Krai, which was the name of the conquered territories in a certain period in the 19th century and up to the Russian Revolution in 1917. And the title marks the denial of the name Poland or Belarus, which of course appeared much later, to the territories and shows how the Russian Empire strove to deny a non-Russian identity for the people and the regions conquered.
And which territories did it include?
We are talking about parts of land that today are in Lithuania, in Belarus, in Poland, and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Your book covers a long 19th century, starting from Pushkin and ending on the works of Isaac Babel. So it's a very long period. Is Pushkin the author who led the groundwork for the imperial discourse in Russian literature related to, for instance, Zapadny Krai? And perhaps a follow-up question, what happened to the discourse when the Soviets came into power?
Very complex question. Pushkin is an important figure, but he's not the first and not the only person that comes into play. I chose him as a starting point more for dramaturgical reasons because he engaged in this famous dialogue with his colleague and also national poet of Poland, Adam Mickiewicz. And I found that it's a nice start to show a time when the elites of Poland and Russia could engage on common grounds on a dialogue of what Russia means for Russians and also for non-Russians. But of course, there were other people that laid the groundwork for imperial literature in Russia. Derzhavin is perhaps one person that one should mention, this important Enlightenment poet.
Mm-hmm. And did this 19th century imperial discourse related to the Westland also involve devices of Orientalization? Because we're familiar with the Caucasus and how it developed as an image in 19th century Russian literature.
Yes, but only in certain periods and concerning certain parts of the territory under consideration. Most intensively, Ukraine was Orientalized. I guess Gogol is the best example for that, for an Orientalizing ethnographic view on local cultures, even though, of course, according to the principles of Western heritage or Enlightenment, those areas had a tradition that preceded the Russian contact with Enlightenment. So contrafactual in a way.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you focus not only on major literary figures such as Pushkin, Gogol, and Leskov, but also on lesser-known second-rate authors such as Zagoskin and Bulgarin. Did the imperial discourse pervade all segments of Russian language literary production in the long 19th century? Or was it more prominent in certain genres or strands of writing?
Well, in my book, I concentrated only on the western parts of the Russian Empire, and those were reflected in the narrative poems of the early 19th century, and then heavily in historical drama and also in short prose, whereas one has to say that the short prose is a privilege that is more or less exclusively present for things Ukrainian, I'd say. In other parts of the empire, you have different traditions and also genre logics that apply differently. If you look at the Caucasus, you have the ode as the start with Derzhavin, I think. And it turns into, I don't know any historical drama about the Caucasus that is really relevant for the discourse, and towards the end of the century, you have longer prose, like Tolstoy, for instance. So I get the impression, but I don't have the complete overview, that there are certain genres attached to certain regions and their imagery in the Russian imagination.
Now, the research you did for Westland is part of a larger trend in Slavic and East European studies that seeks to apply insights from post-colonial studies to Central and Eastern Europe. Classical post-colonial theory focuses on early modern European colonial expansion, the capitalist exploitation of overseas territories, a process that went along with profound racial prejudice and a strong belief in European cultural superiority, the so-called white man's burden. How does this translate to the Russian context? So how is the framework of post-colonial studies being implemented in this different geocultural setting?
Of course, Russia is a different case. And even, one has to say that also the British Empire and the French Empire and the Spanish Empire are also very different from each other. So it is complicated to kind of reduce the colonial to a set of essential features. But for Russia, of course, it did play an important role that the Russian Empire conquered mostly neighboring countries. And I'm not saying that race didn't play a role in the Russian construction of the conquered territories and their inhabitants, but it functioned differently because intensive cultural and economic context often preceded the conquest itself. So this is also why I believe hybridity is such an important concept when studying the Russian colonial and imperial encounter, because we have many instances where you have sometimes surprising and weird mixture of elements that come together that may not appear in those combinations in Western colonial discourse. So this is probably an important feature. And I would like to point out the work of Madina Tlostanova, who has theorized the Russian imperial expansion and its cultural consequences. And she has this term of the Janus-faced empire that has inferiority complexes towards the West and applies Western norms in its own self-image. And yet when it comes to contact with cultures that they considered less developed, in Central Asia, for instance, Russia practices just the same colonial patterns that we observe elsewhere on the globe.
And can the Soviet Union be compared to the Tsarist Empire in this regard? Did they simply continue what was going on?
By no means. I haven't answered that part of the question a while ago. I'm aware of that. Because in the Soviet Union, we do have drastic changes, especially concerning the first period of the Soviet time, like in the 20s and up to the early 30s. The Soviet Union was a decolonizing power because they were very conscious of the chauvinism that drove Russian imperial expansion. So there were attempts, and some researchers say it was more lip service to a decolonial attitude towards the ethnic groups and nations that were incorporated into the Soviet Union, but at least there were measures taken in order to overcome the Russification and the chauvinist attitude towards those cultures. But then, especially in the course of the Second World War and afterwards, the civilizing mission and the presentation of the Russian culture as a pattern that others have to follow prevailed. But up until the end of the Soviet Union, you could detect both elements, and they are sometimes intricately entangled.
Okay, thank you very much. Your most recent book is on the city of Odessa and the powerful myth of Odessa as a multi-ethnic and vibrant cosmopolitan city. Does this myth somehow fit into the Orientalist imagery of the Westland that you discussed in your 2015 monograph, or does it stand out as something completely different?
It is certainly different, but I discovered my love for Odessan culture when I was working still on the Westland project. So they are connected in a way. Odessa is presented as the Western city in the 18th and especially in the 19th century up until 1920, I would say. In Russian cultural discourse, Odessa is Europe, so to say, or it perceives itself as closer to Europe than other parts of the Russian Empire. And then we also have this shift in the 20s with the emigration from Odessa. Many talented people, also writers, went to Moscow and Petersburg. And this was when the Orientalizing discourse kicked in, if you will, because then Odessa became the funny city, the city of strange characters, and also a chiffre for Jewishness that was tabooed and was not being mentioned often starting from the 60s on. So we have both. At first, it was had elements of a melting pot and also of a multi-ethnic, vibrant city, and then it turned into a setting for deviation from norms.
Mm-hmm. Is there something like an Odessa text in Russian literature?
Yeah.
I'm referring here to the famous concept coined by Toporov, Petersburg text.
Absolutely. Rebecca Stanton, the colleague from the United States, has written extensively about the Odessa text. Yeah, you could claim that there is a similar text. Well, it is different, and it is composed also as a reaction to the Petersburg text. But there is a strong literary intertextual relation between texts about Odessa, and you can call those an Odessa text, yeah.
And what are you currently working on? Is there a new book in the pipeline?
Not yet. It's a series of talks and articles, but I'm now working mostly on post-Soviet Russophone literature, and I'm particularly interested in the Caucasus. I have been working on the Caucasus for a while already, and it fascinates me to investigate the texts written in Russian and how they are also interconnected with the various national discourses that are shaped in Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani literature, how this all forms investigation of what the Caucasus could be or is vis-a-vis Russia.
So these are texts written by Russophone writers living in the Russian Federation, or written by people
all over the place. Many of them are immigrants, actually, or have a trajectory away from Russia in some cases, and some people commute back and forth of the authors. So all of them have ties with Russia, and also a certain distance because they know the Caucasian local languages and maybe spent an important formative time of their life there. And therefore, they have a different optics in their Russian language texts when they speak about their home regions, or about what would you call a home region? It's problematic. But you know what I mean. So they are writing, employing the Russian language, looking at what Russia means outside Russia.
Mm-hmm. And this is mostly done by younger authors, or is it a very mixed group of authors engaging with this kind of
Those
topic?
that now come to my mind are of various ages and also women and men. So it's nothing that I would attach to one generation. And of course, those people have always existed. In the Soviet Union, there were many Russian-speaking intellectuals living there, and some of them just kept writing in Russian, but the market fell apart. And of course, the literary market in those peripheral countries, of course, is always under pressure.
Mm-hmm. And do they pay attention to the territorial conflicts that continue to divide the region?
Sure. Especially the Karabakh wars are an important topic, but also Baku as a city that used to be multi-ethnic and is no longer the same city that it used to be. But also what I find particularly interesting is how those people look at the divide. Is it really a division line, or do we have greater similarities on both sides of the Caucasus Ridge as opposed to Russian culture proper? So there's many things to discover there, and most authors aren't well known.
Sounds like a very interesting project, so I'm looking forward to reading the results of this new project. Well, now, perhaps to conclude this conversation, could you tell us something about the impact the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war is having on the development of the field of Slavic and East European studies in Germany?
Yeah, I can. I mean, as you know, Germany is a federal state, so we don't have one politics with regard to the development of universities, and they are also quite autonomous. But there's certainly a trend to rather include Ukrainian into the curriculum, to offer language classes, also to hire people who know about things Ukrainian. And it goes at the cost of Russian. Of course, Russia has an image problem, but so far I don't see it in the number of the students, really. I don't know. We have to wait how this evolves. And unfortunately, the attention seems to be tied to the war, because we could have the same argument about Belarus, right? But Belarusian is not as present in the academia. But there are also programs that try to foster the development of Ukrainian studies. So, but it is really a reaction to crisis and war.
And how are you dealing with this in Regensburg?
Regensburg is a great place for Slavic studies without this centeredness on Russia. And this is actually why I went there 4 years ago, because they have always been open to even really marginalized small Slavic cultures. They have language classes in Bulgarian or Slovenian, and they are including even non-Slavic languages like Yiddish, for instance, or Romanian. So Regensburg really has the tradition of doing Slavic studies without this centeredness on Russian. Plus, we have a newly opened Ukrainian research and teaching center, Denkraum Ukraine. So And this new center was opened after the full-scale invasion? It was opened just 3 weeks ago or so. It is really new. But quite obviously, we get funding from the DAAD. This is the German Academic Exchange Service, and they are funded by the Foreign Ministry. And quite obviously, this is a direct consequence of the war.
Mm-hmm. And do we have an increase in students from Ukraine?
Yeah, slowly. I think this is really evolving. I don't know where we're heading with this. We used to have lots of students from Russia and Ukraine. And then with the Russian aggression, the Russians went away. Some of them ran out of money because they couldn't get their money transferred any longer. And Ukrainians also, of course, had other reasons to stay away from campus, which is, of course, logical. And now we have both coming back. So I wonder where this leads us. I don't know. And it's also, of course, challenging to have them in the same classroom and having to set the rules for academic discourse that sometimes, of course, touches upon those topics that are painful for both.
It's an exciting time, but also tragic in a way, of course.
You don't want to live in exciting times.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Mirja, and for sharing your thoughts and insights.
Thank you, Kris. It was my pleasure.